Hi, I'm Frances, and welcome to my channel. I have been reading a lot of Shirley Jackson lately, and I'm reading today from Shirley Jackson's book of short stories called Dark Tales. And I would like to maybe get all of these short stories up on my channel. I am going to read today, and by the way, my dog is playing with his dog food. So if you see him hopping around, that's what's going on there. Okay, so today I'm going to read her short story, Louisa, Please Come Home. Louisa, my mother's voice, came over the radio. It frightened me badly for a minute. Louisa, she said, please come home. It's been 3 long years since we saw you last. Louisa, I promise you that everything will be all right. We all miss you so. We want you back again. Louisa, please come home. Once a year. On the anniversary of the day I ran away. Each time I heard it, I was frightened again, because between 1 year and the next, I would forget what my mother's voice sounded like. So soft and yet strange with that pleading note. I listened every year. I read the stories in the newspapers. Louisa Tether vanished 1 year ago, or 2 years ago, or 3. I used to wait for the 20th of June as though it were my birthday. I kept all the clippings at first, but secretly, with my picture on all the front pages. I would have looked kind of strange if anyone had seen me cutting it out. Chandler, where I was hiding, was close enough to my old home so that the papers made a big fuss about all of it. But of course, the reason I picked Chandler in the first place was because it was a big enough city for me to hide in. I didn't just up and leave on the spur of the moment, you know. I always knew that I was going to run away sooner or later, and I had made plans ahead of time for whenever I decided to go. Everything had to go right the first time, because they don't usually give you a second chance on that kind of thing. And anyway, if it had gone wrong, I would have looked like an awful fool. And my sister Carol was never one for letting people forget it when they made fools of themselves. I admit I planned it for the day before Carol's wedding on purpose, and for a long time afterward, I used to try and imagine Carol's face when she finally realized that my running away was going to leave her one bridesmaid short. The paper said that the wedding went ahead as scheduled, though, and Carol told one newspaper reporter that her sister Louisa would have wanted it that way. She would never have meant to spoil my wedding, Carol said, knowing perfectly well that that would be exactly what I'd meant. I'm pretty sure that the first thing Carol did when they knew I was missing was go and count the wedding presents to see what I'd taken with me. Anyway, Carol's wedding may have been fouled up, but my plans were fine. Better, as a matter of fact, than I had ever expected. Everyone was hurrying around the house, putting up flowers and asking each other if the wedding gown had been delivered, and opening up cases of champagne and wondering what they were going to do if it rained and they couldn't use the garden. And I just closed the front door behind me and started off. There was only one bad minute when Paul saw me. Paul has always lived next door, and Carol hates him worse than she does me. My mother always used to say that every time I did something to make the family ashamed of me, Paul was sure to be in it somewhere. For a long time, they thought he had something to do with my running away, even though he told over and over again how hard I tried to duck away from him that afternoon when he met me going down the driveway. The papers kept calling him a close friend of the family, which must have overjoyed my mother, and saying that he was being questioned about possible clues to my whereabouts. Of course, he never even knew that I was running away. I told him just what I told my mother before I left, that I was going to get away from all the confusion and excitement for a while. I was going downtown and would probably have a sandwich somewhere for supper and go to a movie. He bothered me for a minute there because, of course, he wanted to come too. I hadn't meant to take the bus right there on the corner, but with Paul tagging after me and wanting me to wait while he got in the car so we could drive out and have dinner at the end, I had to get away fast on the first thing that came along. So I just ran for the bus and left Paul standing there. That was the only part of my plan I had to change. I took the bus all the way downtown, although my first plan had been to walk. It turned out much better, actually, since it didn't matter at all if anyone saw me on the bus going downtown in my own hometown, and I managed to get an earlier train out. I bought a round-trip ticket. That was important, because it would make them think I was coming back. That was always the way they thought about things. If you did something, you had to have a reason for it, because my mother and my father and Carol never did anything unless they had a reason for it. So if I bought a round-trip ticket, the only possible reason would be that I was coming back. Besides, if they thought I was coming back, they would not be frightened so quickly, and I might have more time to hide before they came looking for me. As it happened, Carol found out I was gone that same night when she couldn't sleep and came into my room for some aspirin, so at the time I had less of a head start than I thought. I knew that they would find out about my buying the ticket. I was not silly enough to suppose that I could steal off and not leave any traces. All my plans were based on the fact that the people who get caught are the ones who attract attention by doing something strange or noticeable. And what I intended all along was to fade into some background where they would never see me. I knew they would find out about the round-trip ticket because it was an odd thing to do in a town where you've lived all your life, but it was the last unusual thing I did. I thought when I bought it that knowing about that round-trip ticket would be some consolation to my mother and father. They would know that no matter how long I stayed away, at least I always had a ticket home. I did keep the return trip ticket quite a while, as a matter of fact. I used to carry it in my wallet as a kind of lucky charm. I followed everything in the papers. Mrs. Peacock and I used to read them at the breakfast table over our second cup of coffee before I went off to work. "What do you think about this girl disappeared over in Rockville?" Mrs. Peacock would say to me, and I'd shake my head sorrowfully and say that a girl must be really crazy to leave a handsome, luxurious home like that. Or that I had kind of a notion that maybe she didn't leave at all. Maybe the family had her locked up somewhere because she was a homicidal maniac. Mrs. Peacock always loved anything about homicidal maniacs. Once I picked up the paper and looked hard at the picture. "Do you think she looks something like me?" I asked Mrs. Peacock, and Mrs. Peacock leaned back and looked at me and then at the picture and then at me again, and finally she shook her head and said, "No. If you wore your hair longer and curlier and your face was maybe a little fuller, there might be a little resemblance, but then if you look like a homicidal maniac, I wouldn't ever have let you in my house." "I think she kind of looks like me," I said. "You get along to work and stop being vain," Mrs. Peacock told me. Of course, when I got on the train with my round-trip ticket, I had no idea how soon they'd be following me, and I suppose it was just as well, because it might have made me nervous, and I might have done something wrong and spoiled everything. I knew that as soon as they gave up the notion that I was coming back to Rockville with my round-trip ticket, they would think of Crane, which is the largest city that train went to. So I only stayed in Crane part of one day. I went to a big department store where they were having a store-wide sale. I figured that would land me in a crowd of shoppers, and I was right. For a while there was a good chance that I'd never get any farther away from home than the ground floor of that department store in Crane. I had to fight my way through the crowd until I found the counter where they were having a sale on raincoats. And then I had to push an elbow down the counter and finally grab the raincoat I wanted right out of the hands of some old monster who couldn't have used it anyway because she was much too fat. You would have thought that she had already paid for it the way she howled. I was smart enough to have the exact change, all $6.89 right in my hand, and I gave it to the sales girl, grabbed the raincoat and the bag she wanted to put it in, and fought my way out again before I got crushed to death. That raincoat was worth every cent of the $6.89. I wore it right through until winter that year, and not even a button ever came off it. I finally lost it the next spring when I left it somewhere and never got it back. It was tan, and the minute I put it on in the ladies' room of the store, I began thinking of it as my old raincoat. That was good. I had never before owned a raincoat like that, and my mother would have fainted dead away. One thing I did that I thought was kind of clever, I had left home wearing a light short coat, almost a jacket, and when I put on the raincoat, of course, I took off my light coat. Then all I had to do was empty the pockets of the light coat into the raincoat and carry the light coat casually over to a counter where they were having a sale of jackets and drop it on the counter as though I'd taken it off a little way to look at it and had decided against it. As far as I ever knew, no one paid the slightest attention to me, and before I left the counter, I saw a woman pick up my jacket and look it over. I could have told her she was getting a bargain for $3.98. It made me feel good to know I had gotten rid of the light coat. My mother picked it out for me, and even though I liked it and it was expensive, it was also recognizable, and I had to change it somehow. I was sure that if I put it in a bag and dropped it into a river or into a garbage truck of something like that, sooner or later it would be found, and even if no one saw me doing it, it would almost certainly be found, and then they would know I had changed my clothes in Crane. That light coat never turned up. The last they ever found of me was someone in Rockville who caught a glimpse of me in the train station in Crane, and she recognized me by the light coat. They never found out where I went after that. It was partly luck and partly my clever planning. 2 or 3 days later, the papers were still reporting that I was in Crane. People thought they saw me on the streets, and one girl who went into a store to buy a dress was picked up by the police and held until she could get someone to identify her. They were really looking, but they were looking for Louisa Tether, and I had stopped being Louisa Tether the minute I got rid of that light coat my mother bought me. One thing I was relying on, there must be thousands of girls in the country on any given day who are 19 years old, fair-haired, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and weighing 126 pounds. And if there are thousands of girls like that, there must be, among those thousands, a good number who are wearing shapeless tan raincoats. I started counting tan raincoats in Crane after I left the department store, and I passed 4 in one block. So I felt well hidden. After that, I made myself even more invisible by doing just what I had told my mother I was going to. I stopped in and had a sandwich in a little coffee shop, and then I went to a movie. I wasn't in any hurry at all, and rather than try to find a place to sleep that night, I thought I would sleep on the train. It's funny how no one pays any attention to you at all. There were hundreds of people who saw me that day, and even a sailor who tried to pick me up in the movie, and yet no one really saw me. If I had tried to check into a hotel, the desk clerk might have noticed me. Or if I had tried to get dinner in some fancy restaurant in that cheap raincoat, I would have been conspicuous, but I was doing what any other girl looking like me and dressed like me might be doing that day. The only person who might be apt to remember me would be the man selling tickets in the railroad station, because girls looking like me in old raincoats didn't buy train tickets usually at 11 at night, but I had thought of that too, of course. I bought a ticket to Amityville, 60 miles away, and what made Amityville a perfectly reasonable disguise is that at Amityville there is a college, not a little fancy place like the one I had left so recently, with nobody's blessing, but a big, strolling, friendly affair where my raincoat would look perfectly at home. I told myself I was a student coming back to the college after a weekend at home. We got to Amityville after midnight, but it still didn't look so odd. When I left the train and went into the station, because while I was in the station having a cup of coffee and killing time, 7 other girls, I counted, wearing raincoats like mine, came in or went out, not seeming to think it the least bit odd to be getting on or off trains at that hour of the night. Some of them had suitcases, and I wish that I had some way of getting a suitcase in Crane, but it would have made me noticeable in the movie, and college girls going home for weekends often didn't bother. They had pajamas and an extra pair of stockings at home, and they drop a toothbrush into one of the pockets of those invaluable raincoats. So I didn't worry about the suitcase then, although I knew I would need one soon. While I was having my coffee, I made my own mind change from the idea that I was a college girl coming back after a weekend at home to the idea that I was a college girl who was on her way home for a few days. All the time I tried to think as much as possible like what I was pretending to be. And after all, I had been a college girl for a while. I was thinking that even now the letter was in the mail, traveling as fast as the U.S. government could make it go, right to my father to tell him why I wasn't a college student anymore. I suppose that was what finally decided me to run away, the thought of what my father would think and say and do when he got that letter from the college. That was in the paper too. They decided that the college business was the reason for my running away. But if that had been all, I don't think I would have left. No, I had been wanting to leave for so long, ever since I can remember, making plans till I was sure they were foolproof, and that's the way they turned out to be. Sitting there in the station at Amityville, I tried to think myself into a good reason why I was leaving college to go home on a Monday night late, when I would hardly be going home for the weekend. As I say, I always tried to think as hard as I could the way that suited whatever I wanted to be, and I liked to have a good reason for what I was doing. Nobody ever asked me, but it was good to know that I could answer them if they did. I finally decided that my sister was getting married the next day, and I was going home at the beginning of the week to be one of her bridesmaids. I thought it was funny. I didn't want to be going home for any sad or frightening reason, like my mother being sick or my father being hurt in a car accident, because I would have to look sad and that might attract attention. So I was going home for my sister's wedding. I wandered around the station as though I had nothing to do and just happened to pass the door when another girl was going out. She had on a raincoat just like mine, and anyone who happened to notice would have thought that it was me who went out. Before I bought my ticket, I went to the ladies' room and got another $20 out of my shoe. I had nearly $300 left of the money I had taken from my father's desk, and I had most of it in my shoes because I honestly couldn't think of another safe place to carry it. All I kept in my pocketbook was just enough for whatever I had to spend next. It's uncomfortable walking around all day on a wad of bills in your shoe. But they were good solid shoes, the kind of comfortable old shoes you wear whenever you don't really care how you look, and I had put new shoelaces in them before I left home, so I could tie them good and tight. You can see I planned pretty carefully, and no little detail got left out. If they had let me plan my sister's wedding, there would have been a lot less stress. There would have been a lot less of that running around and screaming and hysterics. I bought a ticket to Chandler, which is the biggest city in this part of the state, and the place I've been heading for all along. It was a good place to hide because people from Rockville tended to bypass it unless they had some special reason for going there. If they couldn't find the doctors or the orthodontist or the psychoanalyst or the dress material they wanted in Rockville or Crane, they went directly to one of the really big cities like the state capital. Chandler was big enough to hide in, but not big enough to look like a metropolis to people from Rockville. The ticket seller in the Amityville station must have seen a good many college girls buying tickets for Chandler at all hours of the day or night, because he took my money and shoved the ticket at me without even looking up. Funny. They must have come looking for me in Chandler at some time or other, because it's not likely they would have neglected any possible place I might be, but maybe Rockville people never seriously believed that anyone would go to Chandler from choice, because I never felt for a minute that anyone was looking for me there. My picture was in the Chandler papers, of course, but as far as I ever knew, no one ever looked at me twice. And I got up every morning and went to work and went shopping in the stores and went to the movies with Mrs. Peacock and went out to the beach all that summer without ever being afraid of being recognized. I behaved just like everyone else and dressed just like everyone else and even thought just like everyone else. And the only person I ever saw from Rockville in 3 years was a friend of my mother's. And I knew she only came to Chandler to get her poodle bred at the kennels there. She didn't look as if she were in a state to recognize anybody but another poodle fancier anyway, and all I had to do was step into a doorway as she went by, and she never looked at me. 2 other college girls got on the train to Chandler when I did. Maybe both of them were going home for their sisters' weddings. Neither of them was wearing a tan raincoat, but one of them had an old blue jacket that gave the same general effect. I fell asleep as soon as the train started, and once I woke up, and for a minute I wondered where I was, and then I realized that I was doing it. I was actually carrying out my careful plan and had gotten better than halfway with it, and I almost laughed there in the train with everyone asleep around me. Then I went back to sleep and didn't wake up until we got into Chandler about 7 in the morning. So there I was. I had left home just after lunch the day before, and now at 7 in the morning of my sister's wedding day, I was so far away in every sense that I knew they would never find me. I had all day to get myself settled in Chandler, so I started off by having breakfast in a restaurant near the station, and then went off to find a place to live and a job. The first thing I did was buy a suitcase. And it's funny how people don't really notice you if you're buying a suitcase near a railroad station. Suitcases look natural near railroad stations. And I picked out one of those stores that sell a little bit of everything and bought a cheap suitcase and a pair of stockings and some handkerchiefs and a little traveling clock. And I put everything into the suitcase and carried that. Nothing is hard to do unless you get upset or excited about it. Later on, when Mrs. Peacock and I used to read in the papers about my disappearing, I asked her once if she thought that Louisa Tether had gotten as far as Chandler, and she didn't. They're saying now she was kidnapped, Mrs. Peacock told me, and that's what I think happened. Kidnapped and murdered. And they do terrible things to young girls they kidnap. But the papers say there wasn't any ransom notes. That's what they say. Mrs. Peacock shook her head at me. How do we know what the family is keeping secret? Or if she was kidnapped by a homicidal maniac? Why should he send a ransom note? Young girls like you don't know a lot of the things that go on, I can tell you. I feel kind of sorry for the girl, I said. You can't ever tell, Mrs. Peacock said. Maybe she went with him willingly. I didn't know that first morning in Chandler that Mrs. Peacock was going to turn up that first day, the luckiest thing that ever happened to me. I decided while I was having breakfast that I was going to be a 19-year-old girl from upstate with a nice family and a good background who had been saving money to come to Chandler and take a secretarial course in the business school there. I was going to have to find some kind of a job to keep on earning money while I went to school. Courses at the business school wouldn't start until fall, so I would have the summer to work and save money and decide if I really wanted to take secretarial training. If I decided not to stay in Chandler, I could easily go somewhere else after the fuss about my running away had died down. The raincoat looked wrong for the kind of conscientious young girl I was going to be, so I took it off and carried it over my arm. I think I did a pretty good job on my clothes altogether. Before I left home, I decided that I would have to wear a suit, as quiet and unobtrusive as I could find, and I picked out a gray suit with a white blouse, so with just one or two small changes, like a different blouse or some kind of a pin on the lapel, I could look like whoever I decided to be. Now the suit looked absolutely right for a young girl planning to take a secretarial course. And I looked like 1,000 other people when I walked down the street carrying my suitcase and my raincoat over my arm. People get off trains every minute looking just like that. I bought a morning paper and stopped in a drugstore for a cup of coffee and a look to see the rooms for rent. It was all so usual. Suitcase, coat, rooms for rent, that when I asked the soda clerk how to get to Primrose Street, he never even looked at me. He certainly didn't care whether I ever got to Primrose Street or not, but he told me very politely where it was and what bus to take. I didn't really need to take a bus for economy, but it would have looked funny for a girl who was saving money to arrive in a taxi. I'll never forget how you looked that first morning, Mrs. Peacock told me once, much later. I knew right away you were the kind of girl I liked to rent rooms to. Quiet and well-mannered. But you looked almighty scared of the big city. I wasn't scared, I said. I was worried about finding a nice room My mother told me so many things to be careful about, I was afraid I'd never find anything to suit her. Anybody's mother would come into my house at any time and know that her daughter was in good hands, Mrs. Peacock said, a little huffy. But it was true. When I walked into Mrs. Peacock's rooming house on Primrose Street and met Mrs. Peacock, I knew that I couldn't have done this part better if I'd been able to plan it. The house was old and comfortable, and my room was nice, and Mrs. Peacock and I hit it off right away. She was very pleased with me when she heard that my mother had told me to be sure the room I found was clean and that the neighborhood was good, with no chance of rowdies following a girl if she came home after dark. And she was even more pleased when she heard that I wanted to save money and take a secretarial course so I could get a really good job and earn enough to be able to send a little home every week. Mrs. Peacock believed that children owed it to their parents to pay back some of what had been spent on them while they were growing up. By the time I had been in the house an hour, Mrs. Peacock knew all about my imaginary family upstate. My mother, who was a widow, and my sister, who had just gotten married and still lived at my mother's home with her husband, and my younger brother, Paul, who worried my mother a good deal because he didn't seem to want to settle down. My name was Lois Taylor, I told her. By that time, I think I could have told her my real name, and she would never have connected it with the girl in the paper because by then she was feeling that she almost knew my family, and she wanted me to be sure and tell my mother when I wrote home that Mrs. Peacock would make herself personally responsible for me while I was in the city and take as good of care of me as my own mother would. On top of everything else, she told me that a stationery store in the neighborhood was looking for a girl assistant, and there I was. Before I had been away from home for 24 hours, I was an entirely new person. I was a girl named Lois Taylor who lived on Primrose Street and worked down at the stationery store. I read in the papers one day about how a famous fortune teller wrote to my father offering to find me and said that the astral signs had convinced him that I would be found near flowers. That gave me a jolt because of Primrose Street, but my father and Mrs. Peacock and the rest of the world thought that it meant that my body was buried somewhere. They dug up a vacant lot near the railroad station where I was last seen, and Mrs. Peacock was very disappointed when nothing turned up. Mrs. Peacock and I could not decide whether I had run away with a gangster to be a gun mole or whether my body had been cut up and sent somewhere in a trunk. After a while, they stopped looking for me, except for an occasional false clue that would turn up in a small story on the back pages of the paper. And Mrs. Peacock and I got interested in the stories about a daring daylight bank robbery in Chicago. When the anniversary of my running away came around and I realized that I had really been gone for a year, I treated myself to a new hat and dinner downtown and came home just in time for the evening news broadcast and my mother's voice over the radio. "Louisa," she was saying, "please come home." "That poor, poor woman," Mrs. Peacock said. "Imagine how she must feel. They say she's never given up hope of finding her little girl alive someday." "Do you like my new hat?" I asked her. I had given up all idea of the secretarial course because the stationery store had decided to expand and include a lending library and a gift shop. And I was now the manager of the gift shop, and if things kept on well, would someday be running the whole thing. Mrs. Peacock and I talked it over, just as if she had been my mother, and we decided that I would be foolish to leave a good job to start over somewhere else. The money that I had been saving was in the bank, and Mrs. Peacock and I thought that one of these days we might pull our savings and buy a little car, or go on a trip somewhere, or even a cruise. What I am saying is that I was free and getting along fine, with never a thought that I knew about ever going back. It was just plain rotten bad luck that I had to meet Paul. I had gotten so I hardly ever thought about any of them anymore and never wondered what they were doing unless I happened to see some item in the papers. But there must have been something in the back of my mind remembering them all the time, because I never even stopped to think. I just stood there on the street with my mouth open and said, "Paul." He turned around, and then of course I realized what I had done, but it was too late. He stared at me for a minute and then frowned and then looked puzzled. I could see him first trying to remember and then trying to believe what he remembered. At last he said, "Is it possible?" He said I had to go back. He said if I didn't go back, he would tell them where to come and get me. He also patted me on the head and told me that there was still a reward waiting there in the bank for anyone who turned up with conclusive news of me. And he said that after he had collected the reward, I was perfectly welcome to run away again as far and as often as I liked. Maybe I did want to go home. Maybe all that time I had been secretly waiting for a chance to get back. Maybe that's why I recognized Paul on the street, no coincidence that wouldn't have happened once in a million years. He had never even been to Chandler before and was only there for a few minutes between trains. He had stepped out of the station for a minute and found me. If I had not been passing at that minute, if he had stayed in the station where he belonged, I would never have gone back. I told Mrs. Peacock I was going home to visit my family upstate. I thought that was funny. Paul sent a telegram to my mother and father saying that he had found me and we took a plane back. Paul said he was still afraid that I'd try to get away again, and the safest place for me was high up in the air where he knew I couldn't get off and run. I began to get nervous, looking out the taxi window on the way from the Rockville airport. I would have sworn that for 3 years I hadn't given a thought to that town, to those streets and stores and houses I used to know so well, but here I found that I remembered it all, as though I hadn't ever seen Chandler and its houses and streets. It was almost as though I had never been away at all. When the taxi finally turned the corner into my own street and I saw the big old white house again, I almost cried. "Of course I wanted to come back," I said, and Paul laughed. I thought of the return trip ticket I had kept as a lucky charm for so long, and how I had thrown it away one day when I was emptying my pocketbook. I wondered when I threw it away whether I would ever want to go back and regret throwing away my ticket. "Everything looks just the same," I said. "I caught the bus right there on the corner. I came down the driveway that day and met you." "If I had managed to stop you that day," Paul said, "you would probably never have tried again." Then the taxi stopped in front of the house and my knees were shaking when I got out. I grabbed Paul's arm and said, "Paul, wait a minute." And he gave me a look I used to know very well, a look that said, "If you back out on me now, I'll see that you never forget it," and put his arm around me because I was shivering, and we went up the walk to the front door. I wondered if they were watching us from the window. It was hard for me to imagine how my mother and father would behave in a situation like this, because they always made such a point of being quiet and dignified and proper. I thought that Mrs. Peacock would have been halfway down the walk to meet us, but here the front door ahead was still tight shut. I wondered if we would have to ring the doorbell. I had never had to ring this doorbell before. I was still wondering when Carol opened the door for us. "Carol," I said. I was shocked because she looked so old. And then I thought that of course it had been 3 years since I had seen her, and she probably thought that I looked older too. "Carol," I said. "Oh, Carol." I was honestly glad to see her. She looked at me hard and then stepped back, and my mother and father were standing there waiting for me to come in. If I had not stopped to think, I would have run to them, but I hesitated, not quite sure what to do, or whether they were angry with me or hurt, or only just happy that I was back. And of course, once I stopped to think about it all, I could find to do was just stand there and say, "Mother," kind of uncertainly. She came over to me and put her hands on my shoulders and looked into my face for a long time. There were tears running down her cheeks, and I thought that before, when it didn't matter, I had been ready enough to cry, but now, when crying would make me look better, all I wanted to do was giggle. She looked old and sad, and I felt simply foolish. Then she turned to Paul and said, "Oh, Paul, how can you do this to me again?" Paul was frightened. I could see it. "Mrs. Tether," he said. "What is your name, dear?" my mother asked me. "Louisa Tether," I said stupidly. "No, dear." Very gently. "What's your real name?" Now I could cry, but now I did not think it was going to help matters any. "Louisa Tether," I said. "That's my name." "Why don't you people leave us alone?" Carol said. She was white and shaking and almost screaming because she was so angry. "We've spent years and years trying to find my lost sister, and all people like you see in it is a chance to cheat us out of the reward. Doesn't it mean anything to you that you may think you have a chance for some easy money, but we just get hurt and heartbroken all over again? Why don't you leave us alone?" "Carol," my father said, "you're frightening the poor child." "Young lady," he said to me, "I honestly believe that you did not realize the cruelty of what you tried to do. You look like a nice girl. Try to imagine your own mother." I tried to imagine my own mother. I looked straight at her. If someone took advantage of her like this, I am sure you were not told that twice before. This young man, I stopped looking at my mother and looked at Paul, has brought us young girls who pretended to be our lost daughter. Each time he protested that he had been genuinely deceived and had no thought of profit, and each time we hoped desperately that it would be the right girl. The first time we were taken in for several days. The girl looked like our Louisa. She acted like our Louisa. She knew all kinds of small family jokes and happenings that seemed impossible that anyone but Louisa could know, and yet she was an imposter. And the girl's mother, my wife, has suffered more each time her hopes have been raised. He put his arm around my mother, his wife, and with Carol, they stood all together looking at me. "Look," Paul said wildly, "give her a chance. She knows she's Louisa. At least give her a chance to prove it." "How?" Carol asked. "I'm sure if I asked her something like, what was the color of the dress she was supposed to wear at my wedding?" "It was pink," I said. "I wanted blue, but you said it had to be pink." "I'm sure she'd know the answer," Carol went on as though I hadn't said anything. "The other girls you brought here, Paul, they both knew." It wasn't going to be any good. I ought to have known it. Maybe they were so used to looking for me by now that they would rather keep on looking than have me home. Maybe once my mother had looked in my face and seen there nothing of Louisa, but only the long, careful concentration I had put into being Lois Taylor. There was never any chance of my looking like Louisa again. I felt kind of sorry for Paul. He had never understood them as well as I did, and he clearly felt there was still some chance of talking them into opening their arms and crying out, "Louisa, our long-lost daughter," and then turning around and handing him the reward. After that, we could all live happily ever after. While Paul was still trying to argue with my father, I walked over a little way and looked into the living room again. I figured I wasn't going to have much time to look around, and I wanted one last glimpse to take away with me. Sister Carol kept a good eye on me all the time, too. I wondered what the two girls before me had tried to steal, and I wanted to tell her that if I ever planned to steal anything from that house, I was 3 years too late. I could have taken whatever I wanted when I left the first time. There was nothing there I could take now any more than there had been before. I realized that all I wanted was to stay. I wanted to stay so much that I felt like hanging onto the stair rail and screaming. But even though a temper tantrum might bring them some fleeting recollection of their dear lost Louisa, I hardly thought it would persuade them to invite me to stay. I could just picture myself being dragged kicking and screaming out of my own house. Such a lovely house, I said politely to my sister Carol, who was hovering around me. Our family has lived here for generations, she said just as politely. Such beautiful furniture, I said. My mother is fond of antiques. Fingerprints, Paul was shouting. We were going to get a lawyer, I gathered, or at least Paul thought we were going to get a lawyer, and I wondered how he was going to feel when he found out that we weren't. I couldn't imagine any lawyer in the world who could get my mother and my father and my sister Carol to take me back when they had made up their minds that I was not Louisa. Could the law make my mother look into my face and recognize me? I thought that there ought to be some way I could make Paul see that there was nothing we could do, and I came over and stood next to him. Paul, I said, can't you see that you're only making Mr. Tether angry? Correct, young woman, my father said, and nodded at me to show that he thought I was a sensible creature. He's not doing himself any good by threatening me. Paul, I said, these people don't want us here. Paul started to say something, and then for the first time in his life thought better of it and stamped off toward the door. When I turned to follow him, thinking that we'd never gotten past the front hall in my great homecoming, my father, Mr. Tether, came up behind me and took my hand. My daughter was younger than you are, he said to me very kindly, but I'm sure you have a family somewhere who love you and want you to be happy. Go back to them, young lady. Let me advise you as though I were really your father. Stay away from that fellow. He's wicked and he's worthless. Go back home where you belong. We know what it's like for a family to worry and wonder about a daughter, my mother said. Go back to the people who love you. That meant Mrs. Peacock, I guess. Just to make sure you get there, my father said, let us help toward your fare. I tried to take my hand away, but he put a folded bill into it and I had to take it. I hope someday, he said, that someone will do as much for our Louisa. Goodbye, my dear, my mother said, and she reached up and patted my cheek. Very good luck to you. I hope your daughter comes back someday, I told them. Goodbye. The bill was a 20, and I gave it to Paul. It seemed little enough for all the trouble he had taken, and after all, I could go back to my job in the stationery store. My mother still talks to me on the radio once a year, on the anniversary of the day I ran away. Louisa, she says, please come home. We all want our dear girl back, and we need you and miss you so much. Your mother and father love you, and we will never forget you. Louisa, please come home. The end.